tell us why you even decided you wanted to become a police officer in the District of Columbia.
Yeah, well, I certainly appreciate that question. And when you said that, you just brought back some memories. I was actually Chief Fullwood's police cadet. That was one of my first assignments when I joined our department. I joined at a time really as a young man, a young African-American man, growing up over in Ward 5 in Carver Terrace. Quite frankly, unsure of what my future would really hold. Several of my teachers like, go straight to college. I was in JROTC at one point, kind of enjoyed that, thought about the military. I had an aunt who was a DC police officer. So, the police department was obviously an area of interest, but it was just something about when they introduced this program to the kids at Spingarn High School at that time that it just grabbed me. And at that moment, I knew because of all the things that were happening in our communities, like, look, I want to help my community. I want to serve my community. I want to be that kid from Carver Terrace who's coming back as a patrol officer, engaging kids in the community. And it gave me certainly a unique perspective on, just how to engage with law enforcement, because all of those interactions were not necessarily positive over the course of years, but it just gave me a unique perspective. And once I got here, I started doing ride-alongs with police officers in 5D, and I knew that this was what I was going to do for the rest of my adult life, really.
I guess what precipitated that comparison was we were looking at homicide numbers.
Yeah.
And trying to compare, the homicide rate probably at this time during that period with where we are today. And of course, the numbers were much higher, which is why we were, labeled the murder capital, not only of the United States, but of the world. And Chief Fullwood talked at that time about the emotional impact that it has on officers, particularly chiefs, going through that kind of, that situation, and recognizing that you can do your job as police, but you just, people want you to stop it, but you just don't know how. And there's a quote in there that's escaping me right now, but he talked about, I think it was the stripes or something, and I'm wondering, how are you feeling now with, all that you've seen, particularly over the past year? How's this affecting you, Chief?
Yeah, so I try to remain, and I've always been a person who's I try to remain very optimistic about life just in general. And, I believe in Washington, D.C. I believe in the citizens of the city. I believe in the police officers who patrol our communities. And I know that we can, do better than what we're doing right now. But it is disheartening, when I have to get out of my bed and, my son is asking me, my 8-year-old son, why am I leaving the house? Or when I come back in late, what was I out doing? Kind of thing. And, and trying to explain to an 8-year-old, what you just had to witness. It certainly takes its toll. Granted, I've been doing this for a very long time, and even had a time in my career where I led our homicide division. I mean, see the worst of what humanity has to offer. But what really brings the balance for me, which is why I am so determined to stay engaged in community, is as I'm out here and I'm talking to people in community all across the city, I see the good in people. I see the good in residents who just want to enjoy their neighborhood or the community park or the cookout or whatever it is. I see just so much of Washington, D.C. and people in those settings. So as much as I go to scenes where things are bad, I try to equally get out there and engage community in positive spaces to bring that balance for me.
It's interesting that you would talk about having an 8-year-old son, because, there are a lot of parents in DC who, when they hear some of the stories about, like, the young girl, 6 years old that was killed here at Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, and children get somewhat fearful, and so parents don't really know how to have that conversation with them to make their children feel safe, other than to say, don't worry about it because Chief Contee is taking care of it. But I mean, if you were to advise parents on how they should have those conversations about the safety of our city, what would you tell them?
You know, and I've had to, this is kind of been a something that I've had to experience it for myself in order to make it through this. I am honest with my son, but age appropriate honest with him. He knows that there are bad guys out in community that make communities unsafe, and they do things that make communities unsafe. And daddy's responsibility is to do all that I can with the resources that I have at my disposal to make sure that bad guys are not out here making communities unsafe. And there are times when he sees a police car going up the street or an ambulance even, you know, he gets concerned about that when he sees that. But I try to be as honest as I possibly can with him without, you know, making my son overly fearful about, you know, what's happening in community. You know, I've always said this, that, you know, people, I think, respond to violent acts differently, especially when it's in their block, right? When their kids are impacted. It's over there. It's not in my community, right? But these are conversations that we should be having with our children, I believe, to bring awareness to this. You know, when you unfortunately are in some communities and, you know, and you have kids who see this as, you know, violence as a norm, that's not normal, and it shouldn't be normal. And we got to talk to our kids about things like conflict resolution, right? And I think those are conversations that, you know, we're not having enough of these conversations, because from what I see through my lens, you know, I see that kids can have a conversation over Instagram that can lead to a homicide. Some unresolved conflict on social media with our young people that results in a homicide. How is that possible, and why? Why is it that those types of things happen? So I think that the earlier we can have these, you know, conversations, age-appropriate conversations with our kids, and kind of transition that into something that's useful for them about stigmatizing gun violence and talking about conflict resolution, I think our communities will be better served as a result of those important conversations.
You know, that was one of the questions that I wanted to add as well, is about social media. I mean, we know that, you know, from, you know, got a musician in my household who talks about, you know, DC music. In some cases, it's very violent. The conversations, like you said, that are occurring on social media. Is that one of the tools you all use in maybe to either de-escalate or to try to prevent incidents? Do you use social media? I know you, I don't know how you do it, but how do you use social media to figure out how to diffuse conflicts in the community? What can you tell us?
Yeah, so what I can tell you is that, I mean, it's more of a tool to keep the pulse of what's going on. And from that, you know, we may learn that an appropriate response could be that this is something where community members, violence interrupters, council members, whoever, you know, might be better suited to help bring resolve to a conflict versus something that would require a response from a police officer, right? When a police officer engages, generally it's because, you know, it's the precursor to some crime that occurred or some crime that has occurred. But sometimes you might just have, you know, people that are talking back and forth. And, you know, if someone who has credibility with these groups or individuals who may have issues with each other, if someone with credibility is able to intervene in that space, you know, we will never necessarily get the credit for the number of beefs that we disrupt or the number of homicides that you prevent, because it's hard to really quantify what that number looks like, right? It's really hard to quantify that. But what I think that we can do, and what we certainly do on our side, is we recognize that this is a space where a lot of people communicate when they're not looking at traditional news and that kind of thing. And we certainly need to be aware of what's going on in that space.
Mm-hmm. You know, we talked about the violence interrupters, and you know, with this whole movement to defund the police, and of course, you know, we know that the mayors supported you adding more police officers to the force. This council didn't support that measure, and so now we're looking at alternative options. How do you work with the violence interrupters that are across the city? And do you think that they are effective?
Well, we have a good relationship from the standpoint that I have availed the police department as a resource for them. Any information that they are willing to share with respect to things that are happening in community. At the end of the day, to me, it doesn't matter who gets the credit for it. I want to prevent violence. That's what I want. I don't want people to get shot. And whether a police officer or a violence interrupter intervenes in that space, I think that we have to have the lines of communication clearly open. I think that if you look at this on a national scale, and even here in Washington, D.C., to try to find the evidence, if you will, to say that this is successful or not, I think it will be difficult to really find the evidence to support that, simply because of what I said a few minutes ago. How do you really measure the homicides that don't occur? How do you measure the cases that they intervene in and nobody actually pulls the trigger, but for intervention by law enforcement or by a violence interrupter? I think that there's a lot more work to do in that space before we can really say, it works, it doesn't work. But I also think that we have to have a both entity approach, a violence interrupter coupled with the law enforcement approach, because the reality is, and I've seen this in 30 years, and I've had conversation with people in community. Some people don't want to take advantage of the programs that are available. They don't want to take advantage of they don't want to hear what the violence interrupters have to say. Some of them will tell you, oh, some of these guys are old, they're disconnected, they don't know this community. You hear all that kind of stuff from some communities. And in that space where that is the case, where individuals have self-selected to continue to engage in violent acts in our community, I don't think that the community should pay the price for that. I think we have to deal with those individuals, whoever they are, wherever they are in community. We have to deal with them different than how we deal with other people that we're trying to find employment for, or that we're trying to relocate them because they want a better life. Some people, that's not their story. And I think that that's a very honest and hard conversation that some people are not ready to have. I'm ready to have that conversation. And I've been saying this from day one, and it's confirmed every day as I move about communities. I hear this from residents. Some residents, the silent majority, quite frankly, who don't want to be in front of a camera. They don't want to be down at a council hearing, but they'll tell it to your ear. And they'll say to you that they are parents, their grandparents, aunts and uncles in community who know exactly what I'm talking about when we talk about dealing with some of the individuals who we need to deal with in these spaces that continue to make communities unsafe.
Have you been able to, kind of pinpoint what some of the conflicts are about? You talked about Instagram, but what are they? Is it turf wars? What are they fighting? What are they killing each other over?
So it's a combination of different things. It's almost reminiscent for me of growing up in Carver Terrace, and we had conflict with Langston Terrace, and we had conflict with Trinidad. It was just historical, right? In some instances, we see that now. Some things are just historical. I can't tell you why we didn't get along with those guys. I just knew that if you grew up on this side of 21st Street and you lived 21st in Maryland, 21st and 9th Street, the guys who lived down at 21st and 8th Street, in Langston Terrace, they were just not your friends. And it was just not a good situation when these two groups came together. Back then, it was, if it was at the carnival over at Stadium Armory or some go-go event at the Coliseum, and those groups came together at some point, it was just not a good situation. And we see a lot of that still now. To add to that now, social media, where the conflicts, it moves very fast. Before then, it was okay, the people at the carnival engaged in a conflict or something like that. But now, a beef that starts on social media, and there's some rap song or diss song that drops from some group where they're posting up and they're saying this and this and that about some community. And now you got thousands of people who are viewing this conflict and waiting on a response from the other group. It's fuel in the fire now. And now you got outside people who are not necessarily part of these communities adding to that, commenting about, what this community did or didn't do in response, right? Some communities, most communities, don't want to be viewed as, oh, we weak, or, we won't respond, so there's a lot of this stuff that goes on. There's also just a lot of personal, petty disputes that really just don't make any sense to me. When you look at what the real issue is behind why somebody lost their life, and you're like, oh, this is the argument over a fight, a boxing match, or this was an argument over a football game and somebody lost their life, or multiple people got shot because someone was trying to shoot the person who they had some dispute with. So when you kind of throw all of these things in a bag together, and lastly, I will say, add to that just the availability of firearms across our communities at the level that they are now. I've been doing this a long time, and I'm telling you, we are awash in firearms in our communities, not just handguns, but handguns and long guns. And I'm seeing it more and more and more at every scene that I go to. And when you have people who are gathering up in communities like we traditionally do here in Washington, D.C., right? It's 15 people hanging out here, whatever. Some will say, oh, they out here doing this. Some will say they're just hanging out. But when bullets start flying and you got 15 people standing there together, and 5 or 6 or 7 of those people get hit because the person on the other end of that is shooting, an automatic rifle or something like that, that's disturbing to me. It's upsetting to me. And it should be, and I know it is for many residents in our city. So all of these things it's just like the perfect storm of all of these things going on right now. And it's really kind of at a point where, I'm hopeful that council and others who look at this don't look at this through a narrow lens. I'm not saying that it's all police. I'm not saying that it's all programming your way out of this. I'm saying that we got to take multiple approaches to this in order to resolve these issues, but we should not compromise in the area of law enforcement and public safety to try to bring resolve, because we got people, real people, children, adults, you name it, that are on the receiving end of some of the gun violence we're seeing in our city.
You talked also about the guys that would gather, but we're seeing now more females, also females that are victims of gun violence, females with children, guys with children. So it doesn't seem to matter so much that, guys walking down the street with his, 4 or 5-year-old son or daughter, that's, he ends up being a victim, and the child as well. But I also wanted to talk about the increased number of, 1, females, and 2, a little bit about these carjackings, which now we're seeing, 10, 12, 13, 14-year-olds. Now, we saw this before. Again, there's nothing new under the sun. We went through this a few years back. I know over off of Benning Road, I remember, a lot of community getting together about that issue. But what's causing this to come back up again, Chief? What are you seeing with regards to these younger perpetrators of crimes?
So and this is my view from a number of different perspectives, as a dad, as a police officer in this city for a long time, I think that we have to be very careful with how we deal with our young people. If my son sees that there's no accountability or no consequence associated with the behavior that he's displaying, then he continues on down that line of behavior if there's no consequence to it, right? And I think that, and this is where I am challenging our criminal justice system and our city as a whole in terms of how we think about how we deal with our young people, right? Should we, when we have a person who's 14 or 15 years of age, armed with a firearm, taking somebody's car from them, while the general thought is, hey, we need to, get them some help. We need to find a program for them. We need to get them back, with their parents and, this kind of thing. The reality is that might not be the best placement for some of our young people. Perhaps there's no structure in the families that they are coming from, which is the reason why at 14 and 15, they're putting a gun in somebody's face and taking their car from them. So is there some alternative other than just releasing them back out into community where they victimize people over and over again? And there seems to be no accountability for the actions that they have in community. No, we have a youth Rehabilitation Act and all these kind of things. We want to look at crimes that young people have committed later on down the line, and we are a very forgiving city, and I don't have a problem with us being a forgiving city, but I think that as we look at what we're facing right now, we have to really understand if what we're doing is not working, and what are we willing to do different beyond just law enforcement incarcerating people, beyond us, right? It goes beyond. We're talking about reimagining the police. That's great. We're an easy target. I can find 20 things that we can reimagine. But when we start going into other spaces and say, hey, look, we need to think about doing this differently, or we need to think about doing that differently, folks kind of, their toes get stepped on, and people don't want to have those conversations. But if we're talking about public safety, as long as I'm chief of police in the Metropolitan Police Department in this city, I'm going to just tell it like it is. We need to rethink that space. Some kids who are 14 and 15 who are out here continuously robbing people, I would say that they probably are not ready to be in our communities right now. And what that looks like, I don't know. I've heard of young people who, we've sent them away to schools and so forth in other states. They go there, they get structure, they do well, and after a while, they're able to come back and, and do something meaningful. Maybe we need to look at those opportunities that provide structure for them if they can't get it at home, or they necessarily can't get it in some of the shelter facilities that they have for some of the young people that are in communities. Some of those programs, there's just not the accountability that we would expect to see. And people are asking me, Chief, how does this guy? I mean, we just had one recently. How does these kids? How they do 4 or 5 of these, right? And you guys have arrested them before. I'm like, yeah, we arrested them before, and I mean, again, that would beg the question, like, how do we get to this space? How did this kid get back here? So there should be some evaluation of the system from the point of failure, which oftentimes is before they become involved with law enforcement, when they were missing school and they were running away and they were doing this and doing that. All of those things leading up to their point of incarceration. That's the failure point as far as I'm concerned. And then after they got incarcerated or taken into custody for whatever it was they did, what are those things that happened after that? What happened after that within the system? After they got, initially presented before a judge, what happened there? At sentencing, what happened there? What happened all the way through the process? And if the community is comfortable with what we're seeing, that's great. But as long as we got violent crime going on in our city, I think that we have to look through a different lens when we see that we have people who will repeatedly commit violent acts and make communities unsafe. Whether they 13 years of age, I understand their frontal cortex is not fully developed. I get that. But in the meantime, with them out here carjacking people and making communities unsafe, I don't think that that's acceptable at all. So in the meantime, what do we do in that space? And what's good for the community?
Do you think, because some have used the issue of COVID as an excuse for why the crime has spiked over the past year, what is your reaction to that?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think COVID plays a part, right? I mean, people have been bottled up for a year. They haven't been able to necessarily interact with some of those systems or checks and balances that we have in place in person. So maybe your probation officer or the person who you normally check in with, now it's over Zoom and it's not in person. That can certainly contribute to it, to a degree. But I think that we have been on this road for a minute. I really do. I think we've been on this road. When you talk about accountability, I don't think it just happened with COVID. I think and this is personally just to think, as we had kind of look at our young kids in our city that are engaged in the use of marijuana and all that kind of stuff, just some of the things that have happened. I think it really has got us on this road. And I think we have to be very, very careful about where it is we're planning on going. And, you know, as a city, as a community, what is it we want to see, and making sure that we're doing things that we need to do to put our city or place our city in a good posture with respect to how we view public safety in our city. I don't think it should be a hands-off approach. You know, we're going to help everybody. You know, we're going to just keep throwing money at it, and you know, I don't, and I'm not saying that from a, you know, just from a programming standpoint. I'm saying that it has to be a very coordinated response to this, and we have to think differently across the entire system, not just policing.
So I know, Chief Contee, your time is running out, and I'm getting signals that ours is too, but I had two questions and I'm done. If you can just answer them briefly. One,
Okay.
we're about to remember, acknowledge the 20th anniversary of September 11th. You were a member of the police force then. Do you have any memories from that date? And then the last question that I want to ask you is, let's end with some good news. Whatever you have, we want to hear it.
Got it. All right. So yeah, I certainly have memories of September 11th. I was a lieutenant on the police department at that time, working over Rockies with Assistant Chief Mike Fitzgerald at the time. And I mean, it was a very sad day, obviously, for our entire country. But I just remember, you know, the Metropolitan Police Department pulling together the community members, pulling together, and just everybody. I mean, you know, in a time of great tragedy for our country, I also just remember everybody just coming together. And I think about, you know, kind of where we are, you know, right now in our country with respect to gun violence. You know, in times of great tragedy, you know, I'm hopeful for the best to really see our communities and law enforcement really come together for a better outcome. Some good news. I think that the good news is that, you know, I'm trying to find more ways. I've been in conversations to engage more of our young people in our police cadet program. We were initially just really hiring kids who graduated from DC high schools between the ages of 17 and 24. Now I'm looking forward in the not too distant future. If you are a DC kid between the ages of 17 and 24, you know, and you want to be a part of law enforcement, I'm looking to educate our young people and looking to employ them with the Metropolitan Police Department so that they can be part of the change of what law enforcement is going to look like in the future. So I'm excited about that. I'm excited about the opportunities that our young people will have. I don't think that there's a person sitting on city council or anywhere for that matter who will not be supportive of that. So I'm looking forward to what the outcome of that is going to be. And that is more kids that are homegrown like me that decide to make law enforcement a future for them. So I'm excited about that.
Wonderful. And so are we. You mentioned that before, and you mentioned the number of women that were joining the force as well. I think we tried to do a little story on that one as well, but we're going to follow you on that.
Yes, ma'am.
Make sure that we can create some paths to opportunities, help to create paths to opportunities with MPD. Chief Robert Contee, thank you so very much for being with us and for sharing this time. Our show's always open to you. We want to help you to solve crimes, and it looks like you're doing the force has been doing a great job with that too. I've been seeing a lot of crimes being solved. So keep up the great work.
Thank you. Take care.
All right, you too.